There's something about Whitechapel. Not much, but something.
I recently visited Whitechapel in East London, the sites where Jack the Ripper operated in 1888. Now, I know many Year 8 and Year 9 students across the country are studying Jack the Ripper as part of a Key Stage 3 historical topic. Now, I believe that in schools Jack the Ripper can be taught. It's a very good way to get to grips with historical evidence, to possibly get closer to the truth on what London was like in the 1880s, and also to look at evidence as if you're in a court of law and, you know, come close to cracking a crime that was never really solved. Understandably, it's a very sensitive topic. It can have quite a gruesome nature, and I do think that the topic needs to be handled with care. This video looks at 5 women who Jack the Ripper is believed to have murdered. Now, obviously, these women had ordinary lives and families, and sometimes we treat victims of murders differently when they happened 135 years ago to maybe if they happened recently. Now, studying Jack the Ripper enables us to put it into its proper historical context. For example, throughout the 19th century, Britain had been hit by many cholera epidemics, so illness and death was very, very common, and it devastated families across the country. In Sunderland, cholera arrived in 1831 and killed 50,000 people. Another deadly pandemic hit England in 1848, killing 60,000, and again in 1854, where another 20,000 people were killed. 1854 was the year where Dr. John Snow found the connection between dirty, contaminated water that had been mixed in with a local sewage pipe and cholera. He found this out in the Soho area, where 700 people had died within just 10 days. The 19th century was a time of social reform as well. For example, Edwin Chadwick and his 1842 report, Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population of Great Britain, finally linked overcrowding conditions of squalor to illness and death. Around about the time of Jack the Ripper, Charles Booth started a survey whereby every street in London was visited. This took him 17 years to conduct. It was known as the life and labour of the people in London, and it came to the conclusion that 30% of Londoners lived in poverty. It was only in the late 19th century that the government was starting to come to the conclusion that the poor were not to blame for their own conditions in which they lived in. By the time we get to 1888, the sanitation conditions in London are still very poor. There's a lack of drinking water, sewers run into the streets, so illness was common. There was 30,000 people living in Whitechapel alone, so there were over 4,000 occupied houses. It was common for a family of 10 to share one small room in a house. The poverty led to the problem of prostitution, and there was believed to have been 90,000 prostitutes in East London. The pollution in London created opportunity for criminals like Jack the Ripper. Smoke and gas from factories created smog that was so thick that it was sometimes difficult to see your own hand in front of your face. Streets were poorly lit, and they were like mazes with narrow alleyways, enabling criminals like Jack the Ripper to entrap their victims and also to learn the routes of London to escape from the scene of the crime quickly. There was also slum clearances, so the old houses were replaced by Peabody flats. Now, these flats provided a much nicer standard of living, but they were expensive, and so more people fell into poverty because they couldn't afford the accommodation. The common professions in East London included tailoring, shoemaking, and making matches. So this led to sweatshops and factories that would exploit their workers on low wages. With illness, mortality rate, and exploitation, many people turned to alcoholism. These social problems appear to provide a link between Jack the Ripper's victims. Here at Durwood Street, which used to be known as Buck Row, and it's the site for where Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, was murdered. Now, I want to give some background context to the 5 case studies that we are going to look at in this video. So Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, lost her mother to tuberculosis when she was only a child. Polly became a homemaker at the age of 9 years old. Polly and her husband William had 5 children. Now, William had an affair with Rosetta Walls, who also lived in the Peabody Flats. Now, Polly was encouraged by her own father and her brother not to leave the family home, as it was really frowned upon and also very expensive to get divorced. However, she eventually felt she had to leave, and as a result of leaving, she lost all her children, who remained with William. Now, the case with Polly shows police negative attitudes towards prostitutes at the time and how vulnerable women were not protected. For example, a prostitute known as Cranky Sal was assaulted by a so-called well-dressed man after she refused to go with him. He punched her and gave her a black eye. Now, when Cranky Sal reported this to the police constable laughed in her face and said, "That man must have a strong stomach to fancy someone such as you." Polly's body was discovered on Buck Row at 3:40 a.m. on the 31st of August. Her throat had been slit and her abdomen had been mutilated. Here on Hanbury Street is the murder site of Annie Chapman. Now, the case with Annie Chapman shows the influence of the press at the time. She had a comfortable upbringing and was not really connected with prostitution at all. Her father was in the Royal Guard, she was the eldest of 8 children, but scarlet fever had devastated her family. 4 of her siblings died within 3 weeks of each other. This led to alcoholism amongst her parents, and George, her father, committed suicide. This left the family without any income. Annie herself turned to alcoholism as an adult, traumatised by her childhood. Now, alcohol during this time was used as a tonic. It was used to ward off a chill or colds. It was rubbed into the gums of teething babies. And quite often, it relieved the boredom of housewives who used to take nips during the day. Annie suffered a series of miscarriages and stillbirths. One of her children, called John, was severely disabled and was handed over to an institution where he needed intense care. Her eldest daughter died of meningitis. With Annie's alcoholism, John, her husband, paid for rehab, but alcohol was very difficult to avoid at this time, and she fell back off the wagon and started drinking again. John and Annie split. John died, which meant that Annie lost the allowance that he continued to regularly pay. Her mutilated body was discovered on 29 Hanbury Street. Now, all of this information about Annie's life only comes from newspapers. There's no other documented evidence. Now, the problem with newspapers is that it is filled with opinions, hearsay, and contradictory stories. We've got to remember that during this time, newspapers were published in order to keep the story of Jack the Ripper going. Whilst the story of Jack the Ripper continued, editors and journalists would continue to make money. So here I am on what used to be known as Brontë Street. It's now called Henrique Street, and Brontë Street was the murder site for Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride was from Sweden, and she had a very strict Lutheran upbringing. So she was from a very, very strict Protestant background. At a young age, she contracted syphilis and therefore was assumed to be a prostitute. She was just as likely to have contracted the illness from her lover, and there was no evidence at this point to say that she was a prostitute. But the syphilis outbreak in Sweden was blamed on the problem with prostitution. As a result of having this illness, she was forced to ingest mercury and silver nitrate pressed against the lesions. This is likely to have led to the early delivery of a baby daughter who subsequently died. Once her lover had left, she was on her own, and she did fall into poverty and forced into prostitution to pay for accommodation. She did receive money from her ex-lover. It's quite likely that she received this money as some sort of payment or compensation for falling ill with syphilis. She used this money to emigrate to England, where she married John Thomas Stride. Her and Stride opened a coffee shop near the docks, and although it was doing well originally, it was destroyed in the Princess Alice ship disaster of 1878. The couple then struggled financially and eventually split. In the last period of her life, she moved to Flower and Dean Street. She paid for her lodgings by conning people into giving money to her charity that didn't exist. She would also rent babies to go begging with. She also befriended a blind woman pretending to be her long-lost sister. Around about this time, she partnered with a violent man called John Kidney. She was arrested for prostitution, and her body was discovered on Dutsfield Yard on the 30th of September 1888. Now, this is the site where Catherine Adow's blood-stained apron was found here on Goulston Street. She's believed to have been murdered very near here on Mitre Square, which no longer exists. Catherine Adow's known as Kate. She was born in Wolverhampton, and her mother died of tuberculosis when she was only 13 years old. Her father died 2 years after that. She was left to care for her younger siblings because her older siblings had left home and got married. At the age of 19, she was sacked from the local factory for stealing. Now, Kate's famous family connection was Charles Christopher Robinson. Now, Robinson had murdered his wife in the 1860s and was publicly executed. Now, Kate travelled up and down the country with her partner, Tom. Kate was not married to Tom, and this caused some controversy later. But they would busk, they would sell stories about Kate's family connection with Robinson, and Kate also wrote a song which she performed and made quite a lot of money from it at the time. But the money didn't last forever, and it soon became scarce. Their baby Harriet died of starvation. This tragedy led to Kate becoming involved in alcoholism. Tom would beat her, and this was seen as deserved, as Kate was seen as embarrassing him and letting the family down. Tom eventually took the children and left. Kate during this time paired up with John Kelly. Now, both were drunk, both were arrested for disorderly behaviour. Now, one night when the pair were arrested, Kate was released at 1 a.m. from Bishopsgate Police Station. Her body was discovered just 45 minutes later. And finally, we're at the scene of the death of Mary Jane Kelly. Now, Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the victims, aged just 25. She was born in Limerick, Ireland, and she turned to prostitution after she fell into poverty following an accident where her husband was killed. She no longer had her husband's income. On the night of her murder, she was seen singing in the street on the 8th of November 1888. In the early hours of the 9th of November, she was believed to have been murdered then, with her body being discovered in her room on Dorset Street at 10:45 a.m. Studying Jack the Ripper in schools is important because it gets us closer to the truth of what London was really like in the 1880s. It also tells us a lot about the changing police methods. Now, some of those policing methods are still used today. Some of them seem very bizarre by today's standards. For example, many police officers would start to wear what was known as silent boots, whereby the criminal would not be able to hear them approaching. Sniffer dogs were also introduced to the case as well, hoping that they would be able to identify the scent of the killer on the victim's clothing. It also brought the police chiefs across the city together. They would meet every morning to discuss new evidence and where they were going with the case. Undercover police constables were used, sometimes in plain clothes, and on other times even so-called feminine looking police officers would go undercover, posing as potential prostitutes to apprehend Jack the Ripper. Also, a pardon was offered to any potential accomplices of Jack the Ripper. This meant that if anyone had aided Jack the Ripper in his crimes, they were promised to not be punished if they came forward. Whatever your inquiry about Jack the Ripper, and especially if you've got an assessment coming up, I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope to make another one soon.
Your face is as mean as your life has been. So crash into my arms. I want you. You don't agree, but you don't refuse me.